really excited to talk to you guys today. The team has been making some pretty incredible progress, and I want to make sure that we can give you guys an update. Just so everyone remembers, these happen bi-weekly, and we're going to start to be able to show, I think, a lot more, coming soon, thanks to everyone's hard work here. Just to give a brief rounding out of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to be going into some of the development that we've been working on, game design and production chains, user interface design, and then community survey and ACC. Those have both ended and they closed today. So thank you everyone who got their submissions in and participated in that survey. I'm going to be doing some work today to kind of aggregate what came in, get the voting up for the ACC, and then give some overview of the community survey results and get that out on Monday. So you guys should see that pretty soon. So to start us off, I think honestly what would probably be best is, Chris, do you want to give an overview of kind of the development progress over the last few weeks and what we can look forward to?
Sure. Yeah, I think that this last couple of weeks has been maybe best described as the exception that proves the rule period. It's been a lot of defining the kind of edge cases that occur as a result of game mechanics that are very necessary to address, but ideally not used often. And I'm hoping we can spend a bit of time talking about those today. Specifically, I think we want to talk a little bit about the emergency travel system, which is there to kind of avoid you being completely stuck, given that Influence is I think a fairly difficult game in the first place. There's a lot to think about when it comes to travel. It's not the intention to have people stranded indefinitely forever. So there's been a lot of thought that we've put into kind of how do we deal with that? How do we address that issue while kind of maintaining the original travel system and the fairness around that and not having it be an exploitable mechanic. And then I'd also like to talk a little bit about something I think that's been a frequently requested feature, and I think is a really cool one. And that's kind of the ability to delegate control of your assets, especially of the what we call Ethereum assets like asteroids and crewmates and even Sway to your crews, such that you can kind of keep those assets safe while still being able to enjoy their use in game. And so, beyond that, there has been, of course, the ongoing undercurrent of focusing on a Cairo 0 to Cairo 1 transition, which is going increasingly well as we move forward and as Cairo 1 reaches maturity. And then I guess the exciting news for Cairo is that they will be releasing this month Cairo 1 deployments on mainnet and a pretty substantial upgrade, which we would expect to see now support for 100 or more transactions per second, which is pretty exciting and starts to get us really in the range where Influence can be supported on Starknet long term. So I'm really excited to see that. Outside of that, we have this continual focus on user experience, especially for onboarding people who are 100% new to blockchain, have no wallet, never used a wallet. And so we've got a lot of focus on that process, how we can make it really, really super easy for somebody to get into the game, potentially not even knowing that they're playing a game on blockchain until they kind of want to find out about it or start to understand some of the benefits that it brings. So I think some really exciting stuff. But JP, if you want, whenever we're ready, we can turn it over to Proto to start talking about some of these specific mechanics.
Yeah, a little bit. Just before we do pass that over, I just wondered if maybe you could explain a little bit more what 100 TPS means for Starknet. I think we all understand what transaction per second is, but there is some nuance to that when it comes to a blockchain layer two.
Sure. In what sense are you asking about the nuance?
I guess look, like if I can do 100 transactions per second right now on my computer or something like that, that's pretty straightforward. But for a large layer two that's posting blocks to Ethereum and things like that, there's still some nuance in terms of like, is that 100 transactions per second in a single block on the L2? Like
Yep.
what? Yeah. So just kind of outlining that, because there is some differences, and that doesn't mean it's like instant finalization on L1.
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot of a lot of really interesting features of zero knowledge proofs in general that are, I think, relatively difficult to understand. It's taken me quite a while to understand some of them, but they lend themselves towards what is effectively instant finality. And I think we're getting very close to that, closer and closer all the time. Right now, if anybody has been using Starknet mainnet, it is quite slow. There's a large queue. They're hitting their max TPS pretty much constantly right now, which is not very high. I think it's in the like, I don't know if I've looked lately, 3 to 5 TPS range, something like that. There's a lot of demand, I think, mostly coming from airdrop hunting. But this upgrade is going to increase that drastically, up 100 plus TPS. There should be plenty of space at that point. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those transactions will be final on L1 immediately. They won't be. They'll be final on L1 somewhere between 1 and 8 hours later, which it seems long, but I think that it's probably important to point out that it's much, much more competitive than the optimistic rollups, where you have 7 days at best. The only times you can kind of gloss over that finality to L1 is when you're using something like a bridge, like Hop protocol or something like that you can move ERC20 tokens between the chains because of the fact that they are running their own pools and can kind of effectively lend you some on one side in exchange for the same tokens on the other. So in general, I think that that this is one of the huge advantages of ZK rollups, is that as soon as the transaction is submitted, sorry, excuse this dog. As soon as the transaction is committed, they can be proven to be valid and final. As long as you have access to the most recent state of the chain, they can even potentially be proven to be valid in the browser. And so this is like one of those really exciting things to me, as with, I think, forward from here towards kind of the ultimate dream goal for Influence, which is that we can have a game that is effectively entirely serverless, where the client itself runs the servers in a peer-to-peer network that verify and secure the game as a whole. But maybe that's getting a little bit ahead of myself. In general, you should see with this new Starknet release that your transactions are effectively final within seconds. And we can handle a pretty large volume that I think will pretty easily support for quite some time the volume of kind of game activity that we'll see on Starknet. So I'm really excited about it. No, and in fact, like the cool thing that I alluded to earlier is that it may not even be necessarily relevant anymore because of this control mechanic that been implementing that would allow you to even pull one of these Ethereum assets over to L2, bridge it basically, grant control of it to your crew, and then move it back and just let it live on L1, which I think is like an amazing security guarantee that we can have for the game. If you bought an asteroid that's valuable, you don't have to have it live on Argent or Bravos or on L2 at all. It can sit on your ledger on L1, which I think is really, really cool. And again, like you said, JP, like kind of eliminates the concern about a withdrawal of an NFT taking 8 hours. It just doesn't really matter at that point. No, I mean, you would be transferring effectively the control of the ownership of the asset itself back to L1. So if you wanted to do anything with that asset, if you wanted to sell it on OpenSea or using any other marketplace or directly, you would need to go and do that on L1. You need to sign an L1 message to do that. On L2, effectively all that would be the case is that the specific crew you granted control of that asteroid to can play with it, but they can't do anything else. They can't transfer it. They can't sell it. It's effectively locked.
I can go over the sort of mechanics of how that works, because I think that sort of an overview of that would help folks. So the idea here is that our Ethereum assets, which in this case include the crew, crewmates, asteroids, and we think ships. Basically, they have a Starknet account that owns them when they're on layer 2. There's an owning account. And then for the ships, crewmates, and asteroids, you'll have the ability as the owning Starknet account to actually set which crew they are on. You can put them onto a crew basically. And so like if an asteroid is, I won't say owned, but like controlled is probably the better word, or assigned to a crew, then the crew that controls that asteroid is the one who can do leases and can do all the various things with that asteroid that an owner could do. And so again, it's based around crews. Like if you control a crew, if you have a crew and it has been assigned an asteroid, then that asteroid is basically owned by that crew for all intents and purposes, except for moving, selecting which crew is controlling that asteroid. And similarly for crewmates, if you put a crewmate onto a crew, like you can, as the crew owner, you have control now of moving that crewmate around, of even moving it between crews, which I can get into a bit later. But what you can't do, you never can take away the ability of the actual owner of that crew to also move that crewmate, and take it back for themselves if they want to. So it's basically a way for your hardware wallet, if you for example have a cold wallet set up that is the actual owner of that crew. If it's, say it's like a department head or something that's really valuable, then then you have always have a secure way to get that crewmate back. If, for example, your play wallet, which you're playing on with your crew, if that gets compromised, then then that's a great way to be able to recover that asset. The idea with crews themselves is that you can, since they don't have a crew that they get assigned to, that wouldn't make sense. So there's the owner of the crew, which is a Starknet account. You can also delegate it to another Starknet account, and for all intents and purposes, except for setting the delegate and except for transferring it, then a delegate can play with that crew as if it's its own. So the overall pattern for if you want to like completely secure your setup is that you'd mint a crew, mint your crewmate onto it, buy an asteroid, attach it to that, all in one account. And then you could transfer, you delegate the crew to that same account to itself, and then you would transfer it to your cold wallet. And then you would make sure that the asteroid was pointed at that crew, was controlled by that crew, make sure the crewmates were on that crew, make sure that any ships were controlled by that crew, and then you would transfer them to your cold wallet as well. And now, anybody who compromises your play wallet, they can't transfer any of those. They don't have control over transferring them. They can, do things with them. They can play the game. They can, steal all your appetite from your warehouse, but they can't transfer those Ethereum assets, which we expect are the high value ones that will accumulate lots of value. So that's, a side benefit of this model. Actually, it wasn't even the main intent of it, but it's a really nice security feature, we think. So overall, super happy with that. And the thing is that this new model has some really interesting knock-on implications, which Chris kind of alluded to, all these edge cases that emerge from the fact that because these are ERC-721s that have this transfer function, that the game does not control, like our dispatcher, which is mutable, which we can upgrade. It has no ability to stop you from transferring any of these assets between different Starknet accounts. That means that a crewmate, for example, that's on your crew, might be transferred while it's still on your crew. Now it's like, what do? How can you hold that crewmate hostage? What if is it stuck there? Like, what happens in that case? And similarly for asteroids, similarly for even crews if they get reassigned. Sort of these questions about like what happens in that case. And so we've thought very carefully about all of our mechanics to ensure that they are able to handle gracefully what happens if control gets transferred to somebody else in the middle, and how that, if you sold an asset, for example, the transfer, your C721 transfer, can the new owner get that asset off of your crew and use it and play with it? And that's actually where a lot of the escape, eject your crew, force eject crew mechanics came from. So that'll, I think I'll talk about that in a little bit. But overall, I guess if folks have questions about this paradigm before we want to move on, we can take those and then talk about crew management, talk about ship movement, crew movement, and also emergency mode.
Yeah.
Might hold off a little bit on
that. And it's worth mentioning, I wanted to just add to that none of this even discusses the sessions concept, which we are pushing quite hard. That similarly, even if all of your assets were on, say, a single Starknet account, the sessions additionally ensure that session keys have no ability to do any of those sort of like ownership destructive actions. So in general, like we're layering a lot of, I think, strong security guarantees, but trying to do it in a way that's as easy to understand as possible for users. And indeed, if they don't care, wouldn't really be obtrusive at all. So it's an exciting UX challenge, but I think it's one that's like very necessary for us to try to take people who are either totally blockchain naive or maybe even hostile towards blockchain and get them into an environment where they're playing without realizing it, and then suddenly seeing all of the benefits of the fact that, like, oh wow, I truly own this asset. It's not just an empty promise that this game is making, but literally I could take it and the game has no ability to limit what I'm doing with it. I think that's a really cool guarantee that we can make.
Yeah, we've gone to some considerable trouble to make sure that is the case, that we cannot, in the contract we have zero ability to stop you from transferring any of these assets to a different account. We want you to truly own it, and we've had to do some design work around that.
It's a really cool concept. I'll just add to that quick fact, the recap of what we've been talking about, which this new model proves, which hopefully will be proven in the UX. But as Chris mentioned, there will be challenges, and hopefully it's okay that you can run a single wallet, right, and have both your crew and your assets on the same wallet. Maybe a lot of people will start there. That's fine. If you want to move to the more secure setup, that's always available to you, but where you end up splitting, like assume if you have a hot wallet and a cold wallet, or even like a hot wallet where you do most of your interaction, and a lukewarm wallet, it doesn't have to be a ledger or anything like that, where you want to like safe keep your owned assets. What you do is you split, and the crew becomes the entity known as the crew becomes kind of the locus of control over assets within the context of the game world that we've built. Now, and of course that is the context that we're building for them. Other people can feel free to do what they want to those assets in other contexts, but you can store the assets, the ownership of the assets, in a totally separate wallet, and you can delegate control to these crews that will live on your hot wallet. And we've been doing a lot of thinking about just how many, like a crew being sort of like, if you can think, like metaphorically symbolize a pair of hands that can do stuff with assets in the game. How many different pairs of hands, how many different crews will an average human person need to manage to do various tasks in the game? And it's kind of cool if you imagine all your assets. You have crewmates, ships, and asteroids. You might have crewmates that are bouncing back and forth between several crews, depending on the task at hand, depending on what you need to accomplish. Sometimes you'll offload them from one crew, you'll attach them to another crew. But I think, but the core concept is really, really cool, where you have these crews living on the hot wallet. They allow you to enjoy and play the game, and then even these like really kind of, I would say, more abstract scenarios where you could be an owner of game assets and just allow other people to play with your game assets and do whatever they want in the context of influence the game, but have the ultimate ownership of the assets retained in a wallet of your choosing and not even interact with them that much. And then come back and check up on them and see what they've done, in the interim.
Yeah, I think to just round this out, because I see some questions around, like, can we, does this mean we can rent assets or crewmates easily? That's still going to require some third-party, work, because we're not supporting a UI that says, like, rent crew for X amount sway per, X amount time. But I think this is a pretty flexible and open hook for people to be able to develop that. What I do think it does provide pretty easily is, like, if you have friends that want to play and you own a bunch of assets, and you trust them, it's pretty easy to kind of allocate crew mates to different crews, and that's pretty cool.
Even if you don't trust them, in fact.
True.
Have an alliance take a chance on a new recruit with a free crewmate for a little while, and if they don't work out, you pull it back. There's a lot of it
into a wallet that contains a couple of crews in it. That's all.
Yeah, actually, the trustless nature of this, I think, is a massive, massive help for alliances. Like, when you think about, let's say an alliance on starting day purchases 1,000 just base Adalians because they're looking to recruit members. Now they have a way to kind of just be like, here you go, here's one, and, like, you can play with it. But, like, if you don't end up playing the game or you're doing something bad, like, they can eject the crewmate from that crew, which is, like, honestly really, really cool. It's an incentive for players to get their own crewmate over time, but it's an easy way to be able to start playing without, having to purchase that crewmate if you're willing to go under, like, we'll call it contract with an alliance.
Yep. And specifically, like, the way that would work is that you would, set up a crew with a crewmate on it, and then you would transfer that crew to the player, or delegate it to the player, and they can play with that crew and play with the crewmate. Probably the next thing to go over, assuming you guys have asked your questions about that mechanic, is crew management and sort of what that looks like now under this condition. There's basically three actions I think are probably relevant to discuss here. Obviously, there's a lot of UI that goes with them, but the first one is creating crewmates, which you guys are somewhat partially familiar with from testnet phase 3, where you would go through the flow to create an Adalian crewmate. And the idea there is that if you when you're starting out for the very first time playing the game, if you would buy one of these sort of proto crewmates in our store, and it's like a sort of a blank crewmate that hasn't been minted yet. You have that, and you jump into the game, and you start by creating your first crewmate. So that'll go through the standard flow that you're used to, picking their crew assignments, picking what they look like, giving them a name. And then lastly, it would have you set up a name for your crew. So it'll actually mint you a crew at the same time. And so at the end of that process, you'll wind up with a crew with your new crewmate in it, and you would have to pick a habitat that they're going to spawn at, a public habitat that you'd have access to, since that's the only place that crewmates can be spawned is in habitats. So that process would get you to the point of being able to start playing with a crewmate. If you have any Arvide crewmates from previously, from the bottom layer 1, once you bridge them over to layer 2, they would actually go through a similar process where you have to do this create crewmate function, action on them. You would pick them, you'd have them available, and you would pick that one, and then you could go through a similar process. However, you wouldn't necessarily need to name them. You could keep the old crew assignments if you wanted to, or you could redo them. And I think we promised that you can redo existing crew assignments, so this is where you do it, is during that flow. But again, they'd wind up on a crew, and then you have this crewmate that's on a crew that you've newly minted. So I think that one's pretty straightforward. But again, it can only happen in habitats. That's like one of the killer features of habitats, is that's where all new crewmates get spawned for the first time. For the next action that is relevant, it's manage crew. And so this is where you're actually moving crewmates around inside of your crew. So first of all, you can reorder them, which for the most part just means changing which one's your captain. So you can sort of do that in a window that's very similar to what you guys have already seen in testnet phase 3, where you're dragging around crewmates within your crew. There's also, and this is the big change from testnet phase 3 that we've decided, is that there used to be this concept of an inactive crewmate, which is just like chilling in a habitat and not part of a crew. We've actually done away with that entirely. There will now, crewmates are always now, as soon as they've been minted, as soon as they've been created, they will always be on one crew or another. So the second part of managed crew is now actually exchanging crewmates between two different crews. So you'd start with like your active crew that you're playing, and you'd pick a second crew that you own or are delegated, and then you can start swapping crewmates between those two crews. And so this lets you sort of rearrange, who's in which crews that already exist. And I think that's pretty straightforward as well. Note that even if crewmates are on your crew that you don't own, like if you've been rented or loaned or whatever, somebody else's crewmate, you can swap them around just the same between two different crews that you own. They're basically your crewmates for all intents and purposes, except that somebody else can yank them. The actual owner can yank them if they want to. So that's manage crew, and then the last one that is relevant is form new crew. So this one is one you guys haven't seen at all yet. We just came up with it, but it actually fits a really important need, which is the ability to spawn a new crew from an existing crew. If you've got crewmates on your first crew that you want to spin off into a new crew, you can actually do that now at any time. It doesn't even have to be in a habitat anymore. Originally, we were thinking it would be, but there are enough reasons to want to do this at any time. In particular, being able to pull a crewmate off of somebody else's crew. This is how you would do it. You would form a new crew with your crewmate, and then basically the outcome of that process is you pick several crewmates that are on that existing crew and put into a new crew, give that one a name, and then it is formed in the exact same location as the old crew. So you now have two crews where there was once one crew, and the same amount of total crewmates between the two of them. And this,
Plus,
this
now
I
you
think
can
is
mutiny in the middle of a
exactly.
spaceport.
Right. Yeah, if you've got a crewmate on somebody else's crew, you can mutiny. You can leave and make your own crew and then eject in your escape module and go do your own thing. Like that is a possibility now. And that's actually the way we deal with that edge case of like you just bought a crewmate that's still on somebody else's crew. How do you get it off of there? That is the exact way you do it, is you form a new crew with it, and then you're currently on their ship, which you might not otherwise have access to, but that's fine. Now you can eject from that ship in escape module, or if they land it, you can just get off normally, go somewhere else on the surface. But that's sort of the mechanic that you pull your crewmate off of that crew on. And so these three actions taken together basically account for the entire life cycle of creating crews, creating crewmates, moving crewmates around between crews, and moving crewmates onto new crews, which again you can do at any time. And I think there's a lot of play value that is actually going to come from that third one. If you send out a crew of 5 to your asteroid that doesn't have a habitat, now you can, if you want to, like make some sub crews from that. And move crewmates between them. One thing to note about crews is you can't delete them. They don't, they have a lot of things associated with them that if you were able to delete them would break a lot of things. So if you want to get rid of a crew that's say empty or you don't care about it anymore, you could always transfer it, to somewhere else if you wanted to, just like OX00, or you give it to somebody else, or you can just ignore it. And those are sort of your options for getting rid of crews.
It's like a lot of pesky immutable NFTs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can't get rid of them once they're minted.
Yep. We may have some way to hide crews, just if you end up with a lot of them.
Probably gonna need to support it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing we can.
Yeah.
Nothing we can do to stop you from sending it to 0.
Exactly.
But they'll still exist in some form.
Yeah, and keeping empty crews around is, and that's one thing to note is that a crew can be empty. If you transfer all the crewmates off of it, you have to exchange them all to a new crew or form a new crew from an old crew that completely empties out the old crew. Those can exist. They don't have a location anymore. They're just sort of, on paper, like this concept, which, may own a lot of buildings that might have things delegated, like asteroids or ships to it. But you can't do anything with it until you put more crewmates back onto it again to start playing with it again. But they continue to exist.
You'll have some empties. We were considering that edge case too, of like, if you want to, if you just need to peel off one crewmate from your 5-person crew to go complete just a one-off task on the asteroid, you can certainly do that. And then after that task is done, you want them to rejoin your main crew.
Mm-hmm.
What will happen is when you peel them off, it'll say, well, which crew do you want to attach them to? And the option will be select from any crew that's attached to your account, including any number of empties you may have created in the past, or create a brand new empty crew to peel them off in. And possibly in order to just maintain without having, basically a running tab of like continually created empty crews that you just forget about. I think the more practical behavior for a lot of people will be to like have a running list of like 10 or fewer crews with just like names that can be easily remembered, and then you can just
Hey,
attach
reuse them.
the one crewmate to like backup crew number 3 or something like that. Have them run their task, then rejoin the main crew. Backup crew number 3 becomes a recyclable kind of pair of hands, because when backup crew number 3 contains 0 crewmates in it, it doesn't have a location. So anybody from anywhere in the whole belt can then suddenly become attached to it.
Any of your crews can do that.
Yeah, correct. Right.
Yeah.
Anything under that same account.
Yep. And one thing to note here is that these actions can actually be taken at any time, even if your crew is participating in an action. You might wonder, like, what does that even mean? How does that work? And the answer is that any action, like crewmate bonuses, are always determined at the start of an action. So like if you start a long extraction or start something that takes a long time, the bonuses are calculated at the crew for the crew that exists at that moment. And so if you then manage your crew in the middle of that and say move some crewmates onto or off of it, that doesn't change the action that's already running. All the bonuses stay the same throughout that entire time. But what it does mean is that the crew that you move the crewmates onto, when you exchange crewmates between two crews, basically the available time, available until time for that crew, which is the thing that says like when is it next available, because you're doing an action and it's not available until that action is over. Like every crew has a time that is like when it will be next available. It will set that available time for both of those crews to the later of the two. So this is not an exploit to like get free crewmate time. Those will be unavailable to take any other actions until the later of the two. So only do this if your crews are doing stuff if you're willing to accept that like very slow implication, for the other crew that you're exchanging between.
If you thought you could cheat by moving people around, but with that
we
being
thought
said,
a lot about exploits.
It's a really fun thing we also theorized about that could add to, I don't know, kind of the politics and intrigue of the whole thing is what that means with the ability to create n number of crews as you want, in attach and detach crewmates just as you see fit to accomplish tasks, which I think is the best way to go about it. However, the important thing that is associated with a crew sort of becomes more fungible, which is the kind of reputation, and the reputation is based on the history of completed tasks and actions for a crew. Now, the interesting thing is if you have a main crew, through their unique name and where they live, etc., they'll probably build up a reputation. But if you want to, I don't know, go off, do something nefarious, go and do something that where you don't want to besmirch the reputation of the main crew, you might choose to, through a carefully constructed network of shell crews, try and move crewmates around in such a way that they will go off and do a bad task elsewhere. However, blockchain being blockchain as it is, and things are traceable, just like people trace, I think, nefarious transactions in the real blockchain space. You can totally sleuth out the transition of crewmates as they leave and join other crews, and kind of figure out like kind of the breadcrumb trail of who moved where to complete this specific thing, and which crew they originated in, if people are willing to do the research. So
Yep. One thing to keep in mind is that in Discovery, there will actually be some pretty good incentives to not rearrange your crew, to keep it in its current configuration, to keep your current captain, to not remove crewmates from it. Adding might be less penalized, but that basically, like the gel factor, which is what we called it, like might make you earn experience faster or be more effective or whatever. In exploitation, though, we don't have those mechanics, so we expect that there'll be probably a lot more crew shuffling and rearrangement in exploitation than ultimately there will be in the game. So I guess just like enjoy that while it lasts is is what I want to say about that. There's a great question, a couple questions here that are really good. Gnarly is asking, could specialists or citizens be spawned on other rocks beside Adalia Prime? And the answer is yes. Previously, we had thought that they would all just be like auto assigned to one of our starter habitats on AP. Now they are sort of in the same state as any newly purchased Adalian crewmates, and you can actually mint them to any habitat that you have access to, public habitat. Which might not be on AP if somebody has built one somewhere else. So, if you want to hold off on creating one of those Arbod crewmates, you can do so and wait until there's maybe habitat somewhere else, and that might be useful for some people for sure. Nathrax is asking, can I spawn crew in ships? And no, you can't do that. You always have to be in habitat. Your crew has to be in habitat. And if you don't have a crew, you can make a new crew just for spawning up particular crewmate in a habitat. If you don't have one that's currently in a habitat, it always has to be in habitat.
Habitat's special powers are to allow you to recruit new crewmates as well as to increase the efficiency of the crews that are stationed there. So we're trying to ensure that it continues to have its special role.
Yep. Chavot has a sort of slightly unrelated question, but sending rocks to OX0, there may be some sort of quote-unquote burned rocks in that way. Not really burned, but sent to OX00. What happens to them? And the answer there is that we do, I think, intend to allow them to be scanned after a certain period of time, like 6 months or a year, by anybody. And at that point, they could be squatted on, so they aren't useless forever.
Wonderful pirate havens eventually.
Exactly. You know that nobody's ever going to be able to kick you off.
Mm-hmm.
For Nathrax is asking, do crew spawn with food? If not, can they buy and sell them? Yes. When your crew spawns with food, when your crew spawns, it does not have food. You can buy food off the marketplace. That'd probably be one of the first things you would want to do. You're at a 25% of your normal efficiency when you don't have any food, so that would play into that. But pretty easy to buy food. Let's see. Nathrax is asking, when can we expect the new production changes on? It'll be ready when it's ready. But I have finished the refinery recipes, so I can, as you know, I've been answering some questions about those, and if anybody wants to know the recipe for a particular refinery process, I can share those. But let's see, that gets us through our questions.
I think UI, so hopefully we're ready to pictures.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what Sergey comes up with for the production UI. It's going to be really, really awesome. I think we should probably at this point move into the crew and ship movement.
Emergency mode.
And Chris, we were thinking that maybe we should wait on emergency mode until Sergey has the mocks done for that, because then we can show the actions and go a little more into detail on that one. But just briefly about emergency mode, the overall gist is that you can put your ship at any time into a mode called emergency mode, which has some pretty stiff penalties for doing so, but it allows you to generate propellant just sort of on its own very slowly. And so that lets you take your ship out from being marooned and get it back home again. But the stiff penalties probably mean you will never be able to use that for anything other than emergency. But we'll go into more detail with that next time we talk about it, maybe in the next AMA. But one of the bigger mechanics, sort of consolidation and finalization things we want to talk about right now is the crew and ship movement mechanics. And so I think Sergey has some of those you might want to share screen with.
Yeah, shall I? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe start with just that the spreadsheet picture that I shared, just so I can sort of give a very brief look at the picture. So you guys will have noticed that I, in general, a little while ago shared this screenshot of sort of the spreadsheet that we've been working with for how crew and ships are moved around. And so the idea basically is that there's this sort of web of different actions that are available for moving your crews, which can move on their own. So if you guys open up the screen share that Sergey has, it's a little hard to see, but maybe I'll just talk through it. So the idea is that you can move your crew on their own, just as a crew. Like conceptually, you can picture them as being in an escape module that's being hauled around by a hopper. You can move them on their own between different locations on the surface of an asteroid or in orbit in the asteroid, around the asteroid. So you can move them between, say they're in a habitat, you can move them to another habitat, and this is the station crew action. You can move them onto another ship that's on the surface. Either if it's your ship, it's a station flight crew action. If it's somebody else's ship, it's a station passengers action. You can move them up to orbit if you own the ship in orbit. So you can move, you can station flight crew from the surface straight up to orbit, just with the native crew. You're not flying a ship. You're just, being taken up there by a hopper in an escape module, and then going into your ship that you own in orbit. You can move from your ship to any other ship in orbit, or from your ship to any other of your ships in orbit. You can move from a ship in orbit that isn't yours, if you're a passenger on it, into one of your own ships in orbit. You can always move from orbit back down to the surface again, to anywhere that you have access to. So you can basically just picture your crew as this pawn that you can kind of move to any location that they can be at. Like remember, crew is always stationed in a base of some sort, and that base is either a habitat or a ship that you have access to. So either because you own it or because somebody else has granted you access to it. So you can move that pawn around, you can move that crew around anywhere on that asteroid. basically whenever you want. If you're going to orbit in the escape module, you can do that anytime you want. If you're moving them normally, other than going to orbit in an escape module, you have to wait for your action to finish so that you can start moving that crew. But that's the gist: is you're moving this crew around as a little pawn between different bases that they could possibly be based out of. And remember that you would want to do this because you want your crew to be close to all the actions that they're taking. So if you've got like little mining colonies set up somewhere, you would want to move them, say, to like transport that's close to that, or the nearest habitat if you don't have like transport. You want them to be efficient, so having them be close to their action as possible is really important. And obviously, you need to move them around sometimes if you want to like do something, change your crew from being mining crew to being emergency crew. You would jump them from their little mining colony over back to the habitat that's closest to the marketplace you care about. Like it's really just sort of a logistics, like putting your crew where they're best, where they're most needed, as close as possible to that. And then getting onto or off of ships. If you want to actually travel between asteroids, you have to get onto your ship or on somebody else's ship as a passenger. So that's sort of the gist of moving crews around. And so that's this whole entire sort of upper half of the table that Sergey's looking at there is where the destinations are basically, a location that the crew has been moved to on their own. And then the other half of the table, the sort of middle to bottom half, not counting the right at the bottom, is moving ships. So these are the actions that actually take your crew inside of a ship from one point to another. And so this entails basically, there's the cycle is sort of three different things. It's launch ship, which starts with a ship on the surface, either in a spaceport if it's a heavy if it's any of the ships, or on an empty lot if it's light transport, and launches it to orbit. So that's going from the surface to orbit. And there's landing, which is the symmetrical thing
Feel
of that.
Feel free
where
to
you
click
go
around now, or Proto, or
yeah, I could.
if I should jump into the UI.
I'll just keep talking through it. I think, yeah.
Okay.
Because then we can show your windows, and I think that'll be the best way to sort of get into the meat of it a little bit more. You can move your ship from orbit down to the surface, and that's obviously landing the ship either to a spaceport or an empty lot. And then there's inter-asteroid travel. This is planned route, which is moving your ship between asteroids. And that's the whole pork chop plot thing that we've shared in the past. So those are the basic movements there. And yeah, Sergey, why don't you start showing so we can take a look at the actual action windows, since that's what Sergey's been working on.
Yeah,
if we want to
should
take a
we
look
start
at
with ships or crews?
Let's do crews first, because those are
Okay.
probably the
What I had up here.
most relevant ones. If you want to do like the station crew for that.
So we've got this is really the nuts and bolts of moving assets around in the game. I think this is cool. A lot of the game is going to comprise of these, I think, kind of routine actions. But we are focused on making sure all of the they're fully accurate and they account for all the states. That's what a lot of this work. It's really been Trench's work the last couple of weeks on figuring out how to move all the different types of locations in the game, and what, if any, restrictions you have and or strategic options you have of moving your assets from one location to another, basically.
Yep. And so
yeah,
what we're looking at,
you can say, crew that's owned by me, or a crew moved into, or sorry, a location. This is the location that's owned by me, so I'm moving my crew to another thing I own, or a location that's owned by someone else. And in this event, the window is delineated as green, just to emphasize, like, oh hey, like, somebody else owns the target location here, whether or not you are putting passengers on somebody else's ship in exchange for some kind of contract, whether or not you are putting, just like stationing your crew in an available habitat, somebody who's built this habitat and who has marked it, a wide open habitat where anyone can live.
So you'll notice that
green buttons, and this is the blue. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, like that. There is this distinction made between when you're moving somewhere, owned by you and owned by somebody else. That's what determines whether it's like stationing your flight crew in your own ship or stationing passengers in somebody else's ship. Under the hood, it's the same action. You're just moving your crew between two different locations. And the destination happens to be owned by somebody else that you have access to. So you can think of them as the same action, just with a different name, and sort of to hint to you that you're moving into something that you don't own. And similarly, for if you're stationed somewhere that you don't own, like a habitat that you don't own or a ship that you don't own, this is when we have this force ejection mechanic that's sort of active. So, that's sort of something to keep in mind there.
If you've taken the green action, you know that you're in somebody else, a location owned by somebody else. And then from that somebody else's perspective, you can take a red action on anybody else's assets that are in a location owned by you. And it's red because we're just warning you that you're kind of, you're not doing anything with their assets that's going to be like terribly destructive. Like you can't, they're immutable, but you can take a limited set of actions within the game world because this allows for this vibrant interactivity. We don't have conflict yet, so for now you can just like shove people out the door safely in an escape pod. They're not going to be able to blow up their ship, but we do have the ability for people who own inventories, whether they are a spaceship or a habitat or something like that, to take actions on other people's crewmates, crews that are stationed there.
And it's worth noting that this plays into our access control systems. So say you have a habitat that is set to public, and then somebody moves their crew into that habitat, because they can, because they have access. In that case, there's nothing stopping you from ejecting them at any time, which is kind of inconvenient if you're the crew who gets ejected because you get sent to orbit and it takes a while, and then you have to come back down and find somewhere else to go. If there's a third-party contract, which is it's not public, but if you use the third-party contract as your access controls, and this applies to ships and habitats, then that third-party contract can actually govern, who can station their crew into your ship or into your habitat. And this is where things like rent comes in. You could set up a third-party contract that collects rent. You could set up one that checks alliance membership. You could do any number of things, arbitrary logic with that third-party contract. And one thing that third-party contract can actually do is it can govern when you, the asset owner, is able to eject somebody or evict somebody's ship. So if the third-party contract is set up that's like as long as rent has been paid, I can't eject you. Like that is actually a pretty powerful guarantee for the person who's going to sign that lease with you. For the habitat space or for access to a ship or whatever. So keep in mind that constraints can apply both ways, and that would actually prevent you from ejecting that crew from taking that action if you've set up such a third-party contract. Limitations can go both ways with those third-party contracts. But if it's a public habitat or a public ship that anybody can jump into, then they're always going to be vulnerable to being kicked out again. Something to keep in mind. Yeah, and if we want to, let's see, is that most of it? Yeah, you want to talk about
we have most of these. There's some thoughts about how the colorations of the windows are going to work, because all of these windows will go through the same chain as the rest of the game actions. They're going to be pending till they get processed on the chain. Then there's a waiting period. Then you essentially complete them, and then how where we're planning to stick these buttons in the event that you are the owner and you do want to take a forced action on somebody else's crew.
Yeah, that's a great little view of the ship view where you can see the crew manifest. If you want to zoom in on that, yeah, I think that's a pretty cool view. Yeah. You can see who's stationed on your ship.
Yeah, this is well, actually, this is kind of incorrect because this should be a shuttle. Like the heavy transport in this view will never be able to support all these passengers, but the shuttle, like you're gonna have, hey, you're flying this shuttle. In the event, so a common story could be these people paid you for a ticket to go to this asteroid, and they're not getting off, or you just want to drop them off. You can you're orbiting the asteroid and you're like, what, these passengers, they paid their fare, I'm just going to boot you out here. They end up floating in the middle of space in their escape module in orbit. They then whenever they log in, they will find that they have been dropped off, hopefully at the correct agreed upon destination, and then they can choose any lot on the surface of the asteroid. They'll take their kind of like slow boat landing on the asteroid surface with their escape pod and continue on from there.
Yep. And you could actually imagine a third-party contract that would only let you get board a passenger ship, with a guarantee that you could only be ejected at the destination. You can imagine, a limitation there. So there's a lot of possibility with that third-party access, restrictions on both, having access to and being ejected from things. Do you want to show the ship actions? I think those are some interesting looking at.
Let's hop into these. Okay, then we'll get it. Let's go to ship actions, then we'll go to ground transfers, I think, which is kind of cool thing to end on. But here are, there's like basically the three basic buckets are you're launching your ship from the ground into orbit. You are traveling with a ship that's in orbit to another orbit. This is where we did the route planning from 2 weeks ago and showed you guys that whole thing. And then the final and third part is you're landing from the orbit of your whatever asteroid onto some surface lot, depending on any restrictions there. Yeah, do you want to take away any Proto? You want to discuss any of these in
Yeah,
particular?
sure. Let's just take a look at the launch ship because there's actually the spaceport mechanic might bear some little quick discussion there. So, and also the tugs. Those are both relevant. So if you guys later after this AMA take a look at the chart I posted in general, you'll see that there's a key that actually shows the amount of times that each actions take. And we thought very carefully about how long they should take. And basically, there's a key distinction here in the screen that you're looking at, which is the difference between a propulsive surface to orbit movement and a hopper-assisted surface to orbit movement. Propulsive means that you're using a ship to get to orbit, and you're basically like firing the main, torch ship engines. You're burning some propellant to get there, and it gets you there very quickly. So landing and launching with propulsively is actually very quick. That's the PLTO time. And then there's the STO time. And then there's the tug option, which is basically having the hoppers haul you up there. And that's very slow. It takes sort of half of that antipodal time, which is half of the time that it would take to surface transport all the way around the asteroid from one side completely to the other as far as possible if you can go. And so, you can do that to get your ship into orbit, and it actually doesn't cost any propellant. So you can, get your ship up there, even if it doesn't have propellant. I'm not sure why you would want to do that, but you could do that. Or if you want to save propellant, for a long transfer, you could do that. But keep in mind that it takes a while, so you probably aren't going to be saving time, overall by doing it that way. But it's an option, and this is actually the only option for when somebody else force ejects your ship. Say, you're squatting on an empty lot with your light transport, the controller of that lot can force eject you from the surface up to orbit, and it'll be basically hauled off by hoppers. Is what you can picture. Like the hopper police come and eat your ship up into orbit because you were parked somewhere you shouldn't have been. Yeah. But you can choose that when you're launching your own ship.
Yeah, and the reason why it has to be long is because we don't want people to cheat this propulsive transfer method to just get things from point A to point B on a very low
Exactly. Surface transfer takes a certain amount of time based on the distance between 2 points. And so, if you want to move things with your ship rather than using the hoppers with the normal surface transfer between two inventories, you can load up your ship with stuff, and then if you use the free hopper transport, it's actually going to take longer always to launch it to orbit and then land it again than it would be to just surface transfer it in the first place. If you want to actually do it faster, though, you can use your propellant, and you can do the propulsive launch to orbit and land again at a different location on the asteroid, and you'll be there in a few minutes. So way faster in some cases, like Adalia Prime is going to be hours to surface transport something, halfway around the asteroid. So, if you want to do that in minutes, you can burn a little bit of propellant to do that if you want to. So we expect that like couriers is sort of a class of money that you can make, a niche you could occupy just by shipping materials around as fast as possible on bigger asteroids. And so this always gives you like a choice between those two, like the propulsive launch and the tug launch.
Cool and fair dynamic. Cool because one, we need to balance. We really want to balance the clustering of asteroid colonies essentially on a larger rock to incentivize them clustering together so they're not just like kind of like a disparate set of dots of where if distances didn't matter on an asteroid, that's what would happen. You just have like the most anywhere the most optimal place to place a building. So we do want distances to matter, like the time it takes to transfer goods should matter, but it should be balanced against still the cool idea of like you take off under full thrust with your ship, like where it only takes a couple minutes where you just like burn off. So for the economic value of whatever this percentage is, we were kind of thinking, I don't know, this 2% is about right, is a pretty good estimate, wouldn't you say?
Yeah,
Proto?
The actual propellant that it takes to do this, to do a propulsive launch or landing,
ship's tank for one launch and or landing.
Right. Yeah, it'll be pretty small. It's based on the actual mass of the asteroid, so its gravity. So you'll see that AP, for example, has a lot higher of a propellant usage for launching or landing propulsively than your tiny little small asteroid does. Those will be almost negligible, in fact. So it's a higher cost on AP. Sure, but so that's propulsive versus tug, and Nathrex, just to really quickly pick off a question here. Any info on the tug ship? There's no tug ship. It's just your ship being moved to orbit by the hoppers, which are always implicit. Like there's never actually like a explicit hopper that you have to make or deal with. It's just the hoppers come in and move it. A little bit of hand waving, but you know,
I think it'd be cool to have a tug ship later.
Vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
I said I think it would be cool to have a tug ship and design a tug ship because that's just something a lot of people are very familiar with. That's how
Discovery
naval vessels are launched.
We have some of that going on for sure, like where you can sort of grab another ship and get it to orbit quickly. We'll have to think about that for Discovery. But so the other thing that's on the screen, if you want to actually zoom in a little bit closer there, Sergey, just so the folks can sort of see right in the middle there, the spaceport. So for spaceports, like what you might be asking, like what is the inconvenient factor for having a spaceport be too full, like when you have too many ships stationed there. And if you want to go down a little bit, to the launch delay.
Launch delay, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, when you're launching to or landing from a spaceport, the mechanic that we have currently designed is that there's kind of like a when is the spaceport next available time that each spaceport has, and when you launch to or land onto a spaceport into a spaceport, it will actually bump that time forward a little bit from now, or from whatever it currently is if it's later than now. And so the next person after you who wants to come in and launch or land will have to actually wait until that time has elapsed for them to be able to do that. And so if a lot of people are launching and landing, it's actually going to slow down being able to get into or leave the spaceport. You can sort of think of it as like a busy airport with a lot of planes taxiing, and they always have to like sort of get into formation and like wait their turn. So that's kind of what's going on here.
An old school airport loop waiting to land.
Exactly.
I feel like they've automated a lot of that out, but it used to be the case that
there's still some of that. I mean,
long holding patterns.
Physically, there's still limited runways.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Very small. Small airports.
And so the other part of this is that the more ships that are actually stationed in a spaceport, the longer that delay per ship that's coming or going actually is. You can picture it as sort of like a bigger and bigger parking lot that you have to sort of get your ship into internally to the spaceport as there are more ships. So again, there's some strong reasons that having a fuller spaceport is actually pretty inconvenient, and a busier spaceport is inconvenient. So we think we've weighted the times on those such that a spaceport is probably going to cap out at 50, 100, 200, somewhere in there, a number of ships before it's really just way too impractical and you want to start using a new spaceport. So that's sort of our intent with spaceports. And I think, do you want to show the transport one, the plan route one? Because let's
launch into this.
The surface transfer, that works too.
Sorry, is that where you wanted to go? Right here?
I was just going to take a look at the surface, like the plan route action, travel action.
Yes, that course. You mean?
Yes, that course. Yeah, because that one, that's basically what the pork chop plot is going to tie into. This is sort of the end action window after you've gone through the pork chop plot. So you guys can expect to see that a lot when you're traveling between asteroids. But notice that all the launch and the landing, they all have like a propellant usage that they show. So you can sort of see, unless you're using a tug, you can see how much of the propellant is being used. And there's also a delta V switcher that Sergey's built in there.
Yep.
So you can actually change it so that it's not showing like how much propellant is being used, but how much delta V is being used, which is actually, in a lot of cases, the more relevant number. Like if you use half of your propellant, you're not using half of your available delta V, you're using less than half of it. And so like that last sort of little bit of propellant is actually the most effective by far in terms of delta V. So we want you guys to be able to sort of budget your delta V thoughtfully by giving you this tool, so that you can make sure that like when you get to an asteroid that doesn't have propellant available on it, you can plan to have enough to get home again afterwards in your ship. That'll help you out with that. So overall, we think that that's pretty powerful and should help you guys out. But yeah, if you want to talk about service transfer, okay. We've got a lot in this
AMA. We realized we had to update the surface transfer window, which we had designed already, but kind of update it to match the rest of the themes of the other transitions from like point A to point B here. And in addition to that, we mapped out basically the boundaries of a simple system to be able to conduct. We think this is going to give players a lot of freedom and cool kind of like emergent behavior to conduct simple player-to-player trades bypassing the marketplace, which is kind of like the mass player trading thing of goods. But if you're simply working, or a lot of people setups that where they're working on a small asteroid with a couple friends and they don't even have a marketplace there, you should be able to conduct all your simple trading of goods and stuff like that via these other windows. So again, the color codes are blue, send to myself. This is your typical send from one warehouse owned by me to another one owned by me. Green is send to another player. And yellow is a new one. When somebody sends something to you, you're going to get a yellow incoming transfer, which you can respond to by either accepting or declining the goods sent to you.
Yep. And so this is peer-to-peer trade, basically. We think this is really a nice little sort of side way to trade when you're not wanting to use the main marketplace that might be available to you. If you have like a neighbor who has exactly what you want and they're just like right next to your warehouse, like you can ping them in Asteroid chat and be like, hey, can I buy some of that off of you? And then they can send some to you and request a payment, and then you can pay them, and then you've got it. So we think that'll sort of encourage neighborly relations, perhaps would be a way to put it. But yeah,
I'll borrow some CO2.
exactly. Gonna have a cup of appetite. Yeah. So I think I'm pretty happy with that. I think that takes us through the movement mechanics. I mean, obviously there's some interesting edge cases that I have not talked about, which is, for example, what happens if you eject a crew when an action is in progress. Just briefly, you can do that because like force eject crew is always available even if an action is in progress. And conceptually, what that does is it just sets up the ejection to happen after after the action is done. But it's sort of the completion time of that ejection is like after the action is done plus however much time the ejection would normally take. But that's always possible. Other movements of crew and ships can't happen when an action is in progress. But yeah, I think that does take us through crew and ship movement. And again, we're going to hold off on describing E mode, I think, until next time. So we want to really quickly try to get through some of these questions in chat. We can wrap it up. Let's see here. So Nathrax is asking, will we be able to bridge and scan our asteroids on layer 2 once the contract has been moved to Cairo 1 prior to phase 4? I think you mean on mainnet. And definitely bridging, we will release that on mainnet prior to actual launch, so you'll relatively soon. The scanning is an open question because we're still deciding whether to require you to send a ship to an asteroid to be able to scan it or not. There's some pros and cons to that. I personally love the idea, but we'll decide on that at some point, and then that'll have an answer there. Let's see. Stellarad is asking, so when conflict comes, will assets like crew and ships get burnt, even if they are on layer 1? And I don't think, there's no burning. We don't have the ability to burn any of these assets, and that's actually for good other reasons than just game mechanics. But basically, I think, hard to exactly expect what will happen in conflict, but I think like a status will be applied to that ship that says like, or something along those lines. Crews can't be killed. They'll just go into their escape module and slow boat their way to somewhere else. But if a ship gets blown up, it'll probably turn into a blown up ship state rather than just vanishing. Gnarly is asking, are there any penalties to habitat over capacity? And yes, that's a good question. There's two reasons to want to use a habitat. There's the being able to create new crewmates there, spawn new crewmates there. That's one thing. And then there's when you're stationed in a habitat, there's actually a little bit of a bonus over being stationed in a ship to just your overall productivity with your crew. And that bonus starts out at some amount, probably not earth-shakingly huge, but enough to make you want to be in a habitat. And after the habitat gets to a certain capacity, number of crews or crewmates stationed in it, that'll start to decay back to just the normal, no bonuses. So that is a reason to not want to be stationed in a habitat that's too full. And yeah, Nathrax, we've actually changed that from, it used to be just a food consumption boost, but now we've shifted that so that it doesn't touch your food, but rather it's just a general overall bonus to activities taken. It's sort of the same thing since if your food runs out, you start to have this penalty to everything, so it kind of comes out to the same thing. As far as the capacity, Gnarly is asking, I think you mean of food consumption. And the answer is 1 Adalian year's worth of food at 100% per crewmate. So that's, I think, at 1 ton of food per crewmate on your crew can be stored on the crew. And that actually lasts longer than 1 Adalian year because of the way that auto rationing happens. It'll be, I think, closer to something like 20 months. But that's the capacity that can be put on there. Let's see. Nathrax is asking, in conflict, habitats would need to be locked. You wouldn't want enemy alliances spawning troops at your habitat. Actually, this is quite easy. I mean, obviously, enemy troops don't exist in exploitation, but to do this in exploitation, even you just set your habitat to either whitelisted or third-party contract, and then they can't spawn there unless they have access with a crew that is that the crewmate is being spawned onto. So, basically you can lock it down so only your Alliance members can spawn there. And I think that's going to be super common on Alliance asteroids. Now Thirst is asking any info on the tug ship. I already answered that one, that there is not a tug ship. It's just implicitly hoppers tugging you to orbit. Let's see. What do I use it for? Yeah. How many light transports can land on the same empty lot? One. Just always one. Like if it's occupied by a light transport, then you can't build a building there because there's a light transport there, and you can't land another light transport there. And so this is why lot controllers can actually evict your light transport in sort of the same way that they could evict a squatter on their lot. But rather than the light transport being sort of claimed by the controller, like what happened with the building, the light transport just gets forced tug launched to orbit. Then they're up there and can be claimed later. And there's no congestion penalty because it's just one or zero. That's an awesome 3D printable light transport, Commissar. Can't wait to see that in reality. Yeah, I think. Hold on. Joe, can you send sway offer and request materials? Is that?
Just saying, woo! You went through so many.
I know there's a bunch of great recipes. Joe is asking, like, can you request materials with a sway offer? And we've decided to not be able to do that. If you want to do that, you can basically just place a buy order in a marketplace. That's kind of the same thing as what's going on. So in order to peer-to-peer trade, you have to talk to the person you're going to trade with and say, I want this, and then they will have to initiate by sending you the materials with a sway request. It doesn't go the other way. But yeah, I think that
you can request sway, and there is an extra, I made sure we talked about this for a long time, whether or not it could be sort of too easy to exploit, but I made sure that anytime if you are accepting a trade offer where you are giving away some of your sway, there is an additional extra confirmation step just to make sure that you don't get scammed in some way and pay sway you didn't intend to.
Yep, we think we've thought through all these mechanics pretty well. I mean, if anybody has any concerns or exploit plots that they can think of, definitely let us know. But this is what you've seen here is basically just all these mechanics are kind of shaking out. The pedal is hitting the metal, and we're actually fully speccing them out and making sure that they're watertight as we can get them, and that there aren't any exploits, or if there are, they're super not obvious.
And that's also what Phase 4 is for.
This is what I meant when I said this has kind of been the period of the exception proves the rule. So much time ends up going into the edge cases to ensure that the rule itself is sound.
Actually, a lot of times we've improved the main rule just by finding edge cases and realizing, we could actually do it this way, and it makes more sense. So, pretty happy with where things are right now, I would say.
This was a pretty dense conversation in terms of all the newness that we've kind of dropped into the community. So I'm going to make sure to get this in recording. I'm sure some of you guys may even want to look back at some of what we talked about. Really happy everyone was able to stay a little bit longer for those who stayed. And if you guys have any questions about kind of what we introduced here, please let us know. Really, really excited to kind of just be able to show you guys more and more. And then I'm going to be kind of putting all of this together in a email that's going to go out to the entire community on Monday. So thank you, everyone. If there's nothing else that, Chris, Proto, Sergey, you want to cover, I think we can wrap this up.
Yeah, thanks, Pete.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, have a good day, everyone.